Hi, this is Joan Gore, and I'm welcoming you to the 2017 set of interviews that AIEA is conducting with people in our field of international education who have shaped the field and led the field and brought us to where we are today as they near their own retirements in our profession or actually retire. I'm really pleased to start this year's interview series with Dr. Riall Nolan, whom I've known since we both were much younger and our hairs were not white.
That's right.
And Dr. Nolan has been the Associate Provost for International Education at Purdue University for many years, from which he retired recently, though he continues to teach at both Purdue and in Cambridge in England. In his academic field of anthropology. There are lots of relationships between Riall's academic work and his academic life, his experiences and his perspective in international education, and how we got here from his start, like mine, many years ago. I'll let you tell us how many years ago. So I'm really pleased to have this conversation with Riall today. So Riall, tell me a little bit about how you got involved. You were a PhD in anthropology from Sussex University, if I recall, and that in itself is often an international field. How did you end up moving from your academic perspective to the ideas of international education and higher education?
Let me back up just a little bit. It won't take too long. I went to undergraduate school at Colgate University and minored in anthropology. And when it came time to graduate, my advisor said to me, "So what are you going to do now?" This was 1965, and I said, well, and this is the way young men spoke in those days, I said, if I can't think of anything else to do, I wasn't going to go to graduate school, I wasn't going to join a corporation, I had no real plans. I said, I suppose I would just join the Army and get my military obligation out of the way. That's the way people of that generation thought. And he looked at me, and he said, "You don't read the papers much, do you?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, there's a war starting in Southeast Asia." And he said, "If you'd like to be part of that, then joining the military would be a good way to take part. If you don't, if that's not an attractive option, think of something else." So he and I talked for a while. And in the end, long story short, I joined the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
And I went to Senegal, West Africa, and I had to look up Senegal on the map to see where it was. It changed my life completely. I learned to speak languages that were not taught at Colgate. I got to know intimately how African villages worked, and I became fascinated with development work. So I observed for 3 years a parade of Europeans and Americans coming into Senegal, trained in economics and agronomy and finance and engineering, and wanting to change things, wanting to do development work to make people's lives better, quote unquote, but failing in that because they didn't understand the cultures.
Yeah.
So I thought there's got to be a way to do this that takes account of culture, and that's when I happened to run into a couple of Belgian anthropologists, and they said, "Yeah, that's what we do." So I decided that I was going to become a development anthropologist, and this was back when very few people thought that way, but I did. I had no interest in being an academic, but I wanted to be a development worker. So I applied to grad schools in the United States, and they all said, "Well, you know, blah, blah, it's an academic track." And I said, "No, I want to be an academic." And they weren't hearing that, so I went to the UK, went to the University of Sussex, where everybody said, "Sure, you know, we'll help you do that." So that's how I became an anthropologist, was in order to put culture into a wider plan for people.
So action was part of
Yeah,
your
action was
idea
part of it.
initially.
Never really intended to become an academic, but I had an academic bent, if you like. I loved anthropology, I loved the university and so forth. So even though I spent the next 15 years doing development anthropology in Africa and Asia, I also wrote articles, and I wrote a book. And, you know, I did things that, fortunately, when the time came, qualified me to get an academic position. So in 1984, I came back to the United States, and I got an academic job as an assistant professor of anthropology. And it wasn't long before I said, no, this is really boring. Because what I realized that I was interested in, I've been interested in international development. I'm still interested in international development. I still do that. But what I decided needed doing in the American education environment was to get as many young Americans out of town as possible, by any means necessary, so that some of them could have the kind of epiphany that I had.
Right.
Which is living among people who are actually living happy, fulfilled, productive lives on a basis totally different from the way you grew up. And if you get that, then you think to yourself, and so at some point I could live my life differently if I so choose. And that's what I wanted American students to have the opportunity to do.
It's a wonderful way of describing the moral foundation of our profession.
Right. I mean, the idea that these are not your enemies, they are not backward, they are people who think just as well as you do, but they think a little differently about things. And that's very revelatory for most people, I think.
Actually, the crisis we're going through in our culture, political culture today, reflects exactly that challenge.
So, you know, after a couple of years as an assistant professor, I realized that I could probably, with a lot of hard work, get one or two of my students every year, my brightest students, Winter Grand Foundation grants to go into field work, and I thought that I need to go to scale with this somehow. So that's when I decided to join the dark side.
The dark side. I spent most of my life on the dark side.
And I became an administrator because I thought, I don't need to take personal responsibility or personal credit for these people, the way an academic would say, oh, my student went to Ethiopia, my student won a prize. No, I just thought I need to enable as many students as possible. So that drew me right into international education.
So were you at Purdue at this point?
No.
Where were you at?
I was at SIT.
Oh, really?
Yes, up in Vermont. Because I left my assistant professor job and I got a job in a multidisciplinary program. That's the other side of me, is I've never really been comfortable with disciplinary.
The silos.
So this was a multidisciplinary. I mean, most people know SIT and its work, and it was doing very good work preparing people for humanitarian development type stuff, NGO work. So I joined that. And that facilitated the entry of lots of people. I mean, we were putting through that master's program quite a few people, probably more than we had really the capacity to do. But it was fun work. It was hard work, but it was fun. And I moved from there to the University of Pittsburgh. Then I moved to the West Coast to Golden Gate. Then I moved back to Cincinnati. I mean, I had a typical administrator's pattern of about anywhere from 3 to 6 years at each of these places. And this is part of the SIO cycle, is that if you hit a plateau or you've done all you think you can do, you probably have to move on, because there's only one of these jobs at each place. You know, you can't sort of go, there's no more ladder to climb. So I did this at each place, progressively increased responsibilities, a little bit more budget each time, and a little bit more of an ability to move things.
So that actually leads me to this question. In those earlier years, what were you seeing and what were your goals? And how did you figure out how to achieve them? How did you get more money at each place? How did you start? You were part, as I was, or am, part of the generation that entered this field when the field didn't exist. And we came out, I was an academic advising at the University of Virginia. You know, we all came out of different backgrounds that were not international ed. And international ed was not well supported. So how did you begin to take that idea and move it far more centrally into the curriculum, the budgeting, the administrative and political support of these institutions?
Well, you know, I think all of us have benefited greatly from the networking that we've done, and that's one of the reasons why NAFSA, and especially AIEA, when I discovered AIEA, it was through Burkhard Holzner. Because he was at Pittsburgh and I was at Pittsburgh. And he said to me, you should join this organization. And I went to the first meeting and I thought, yeah, I've come home. These are my people. So we learned a lot, obviously, from one another about how things worked at different places and what to do and what to avoid doing. But at the same time, I had to learn a lot of stuff pretty much on my own. And so I realized I needed to know things like I needed to know how to negotiate. And so I would read books, and I would talk to people, and I would watch people that I thought were good negotiators, and I learned how to do that. I needed to learn how to fundraise.
Right.
And I had never, I'd written a few proposals to fund my own research work in the past, but now I needed to understand the foundation scene. I needed to understand the Title VI scene, and so I learned about that. I needed to learn how to train as opposed to teach, because a lot of what you do is sort of that kind of thing.
Right.
And I needed to learn about things like what Donald Shum at MIT used to describe as the reflective conversation that you have, where you and your president or you and your provost build up shared understandings which result in meanings which are original and they were not necessarily in your head or in his or her head at first, but you both came to conclusions through talking, so that kind of thing. And most of that I learned not on my own, but me and my group of network allies.
Right, and all of us were learning on the job.
All of us were, and there was an intense conversations going back and forth all the time between all of us about how's it working, what's going on, what did you try. The thing that anthropology gave me was the ability to look at a culture, however strange it might be, and figure out what was going on there. And I think that was very, very valuable.
That's really interesting, because university institutions themselves are strange cultures.
Yes, they are.
And
each one is different.
Yes.
And so I have stressed this in my own training work. I did a workshop just yesterday morning where I said to people, if you want to succeed as an SIO, you need to understand your own institution thoroughly, and it is a culture, and you need to understand it as such. And then if you change jobs, you have to do that all over again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, your skills are transportable, your skills at negotiation or at fundraising, but you will need to do these things differently, in consonance with whatever that institution's values and established ways of doing things are. The former president of the University of Minnesota gave me some very good advice one time we were talking, and he said to me, it's a lot easier to ride a horse in the direction it's already going. And, you don't tilt at windmills in academia. You pick your battles very carefully.
Right.
And you don't have to go along with everything. Some of it is just nonsensical, but you have to fit in some way. Otherwise, you will not succeed.
Right.
So
as you began to succeed, I think I understand something of the environment you were in. No component of international education was primary at a university. It was always marginal. Whether it was inbound students, outbound students, faculty development was non-existent internationally. There might have been some international scholars or Fulbrights were functional, but it was always the extra and never the center. So you were part of this generation that has moved this to the center. It's a complicated center, I think. The last research I did showed that most American colleges and universities today have some type of mission statement related to international education, non-existent when we started. Many have centralized offices, though not all. And all have presidents who will talk about the value of this. But not all have money, budgets, or support even today. So we've certainly moved far. How do you see that development? Why did we become part of that central mission, and why do we sometimes still struggle for support?
Well, I think part of it has less to do with our own efforts and a lot to do with the way the world has changed. We've been helped in this, it seems to me, by let's call it globalization, which is a very two-edged sword, obviously. It's having a dreadful impact on some places and a very salutary impact on other places. And I don't want to get into that whole thing.
And it's real, it's just there.
People talk a lot now about what's happening here, what's happening there. They still don't know a lot about it. But if you're building a car, if you're General Motors, you have suppliers all over the world, and you are selling your cars all over the world. And so that has seeped into the business consciousness in a way that didn't have to happen back in the day. I say to people, I was born in 1943, and the world I grew up in was a world in which the European economies had been devastated. They'd been literally bombed flat. And so if you wanted to buy a piece of heavy machinery or a car or a washing machine or something like that, you pretty much bought American. And you paid in dollars for it and you spoke English when you were doing it.
That's right.
And it's not like that anymore. And everybody knows that. And so
Right.
business talks about that now.
Right.
And so we're helped a lot by that kind of a thing. But at the same time, I think we've had some outstanding people in the field. Burkhardt would be one of them. John Hudzik would be another. There are a dozen of these people. Joanne McCarthy, people who have made a difference in institutions and have been visible doing so.
Right.
I don't think I've been terribly visible outside my own campus, but people have been writing, they've been sort of speaking on a non-academic or non-international education circuit. They're sort of known around the place. They get into the Chronicle of Higher Education from time to time, and so all of these things, it seems to me, have moved it forward. The other thing that I think impressed me when I moved away from Pittsburgh and into Golden Gate and then to Cincinnati and then to Indiana was the presence of university consortia as a way to both focus learning and leverage influence.
Mm-hmm.
And so at Golden Gate, we belonged to an association of Northern California universities. And we met regularly and we talked about how internationalization was going and what could we do and what support could we give to each other. The Ohio system had, John Greisberger was the guy who sort of put that consortium together, and we met regularly and we talked to the legislature and we talked to lobbyists and so forth. Indiana, at Purdue, as part of the Big Ten, we were part of the CIC, which was run by a woman named Barbara Allen, who was just marvelous at getting all of this to work in one direction, even though they were very different institutions. We learned a lot from each other, and we were able to influence things on individual campuses because we were all in touch with what was going on elsewhere.
Well, this is maybe a difficult question to answer, but if you sort of look at the arc of your career, what are the major changes you think you have seen in our general field?
Well, international education is on the map. In most places, even places who don't have an SIO, probably wish they did have one. I mean, they're thinking about, maybe this would be a good idea. I think that the whole idea of doing more with international education, whether it's the export business or the import business, it has taken root with most people. I think we're also developing some hard-won wisdom about what works best and what doesn't work best. Universities have trouble learning from each other. They have trouble learning in general, I think. They're not very good at it. But they are learning a few things because we've seen some disasters. And I'm thinking, and I'm not going to go into names and places, but all of these attempts to put up brick and mortar campuses in other people's countries has taught a few people in a few universities some hard-won lessons.
Right.
And so we are starting to think, there's probably best practices involved here. And so those of us in these associations are continually talking about, granted that each place is different, granted that each place is special, what are some lessons to be learned that are more or less universally applicable? What
roles have associations like AIEA played in what you're seeing and what you do?
I think they've played a very, very strong and instrumental role in training individual SIOs. I think their voice as a policy organization has been muted. I don't think they're doing a particularly good job of speaking to other people. And by other people, I mean boards of trustees, legislators, presidents and provosts. We like to think we do, but I don't think we do as much of that.
So are you thinking, when you say legislators, on the state and local levels?
State and local levels, right, I think that Congress could be more of a player, but is not going to be for the foreseeable future. It has not been for the foreseeable past. And so I think the state legislatures are where a lot of the decisions are made. Certainly in Purdue's case, with it being a state institution, a land grant, we are very tied to our legislature.
With all the associations that I work, the National Association's advocacy appears to have been primarily focused on the national level.
Mhm.
Do you
Yeah.
not think that's useful? Or do you think
I
that
haven't seen
presents
much.
challenges?
I haven't seen much of a result of it, frankly. One could say, well, if we weren't doing it, we wouldn't have a Fulbright program, we wouldn't have a Title VI program. That's possibly true. I mean,
Right.
I have no way to prove a negative. But I think that the real policy work has got to be done at the state and even at the local levels.
Okay.
And I can think of two things that I think we're not doing anywhere near enough with. One of them is changing the pattern of incentives for faculty members to engage in international education in the first place. Only about 10% of our nation's universities and colleges have any form of tenure and promotion policy which even recognizes international activity as valid for consideration. This is ridiculous. And I have said this directly to college presidents when I get interviewed, and maybe significantly I don't get a lot of those jobs. But I've said to them, you need to change the pattern of incentives. You don't need to prioritize international. You simply need to make it part of what's considered in a tenure dossier. You are deliberately excluding huge masses of experience that people have had, which you say doesn't count for anything. Why is that? I'll back up. When we were fighting the war in Iraq, there was a newspaper article that said something to the effect that, oh, we have the biggest embassy in the world in Baghdad and we only have like 6 Arabic speakers. And everybody went around saying, well, that just goes to show you that Americans aren't any good at languages. And I said, no. I said 750,000 American citizens speak Arabic at home.
Right.
So I said, what it says is an awful lot about State Department policy,
Right.
about who they recruit and who they promote. And it's the same thing in academia. You have people with, say, a background in the Peace Corps who speak foreign languages, who've lived for extended periods of time overseas. That doesn't count for recruitment in
Right.
most of these places. They say, well, what's your scholarly record? What are your research publications? Okay, fine. And so you are, as it were, cutting yourself off. And then, when you're on the tenure track, you get told, no, you shouldn't be doing any of that international work, that won't count. So, long story short, all you need to do is change this.
Right.
And it is as if you sort of opened the Bible and said, okay, this first page of Genesis, we need to take that out and completely rewrite it. And people would say, well, I don't think we're going to do that. And that's been the response. So I think until we do that, internationalization is going to take longer, cost more, and probably be less effective.
Right. Right.
Because faculty are very good at doing what they want to do.
Right.
And a lot of them want to do this, but they don't see how it's going to help them in their career.
Right.
So
And tenure and promotion are ever more difficult.
Exactly, and they're fundamental to motivate people. The other thing that we need to be doing is getting out of the university and into our local communities to explain what an incredible economic driver internationalization is for local economies.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to make this up. The facts and figures speak for themselves. We're talking about jobs, we're talking about money, we're talking about the influx of professional people into our communities. And this is not a new story for people. They can see this when they go to the doctor's office. They can see when they go to talk to professional people. A lot of them now look a little different from the people that we all grew up with. Why is that? It's all connected to this, and so I think it's a very, very easy story to tell people, one which will resonate with them regardless of their political persuasions.
Right.
Democrats and Republicans both want jobs. They want good people in their community. They want things to work. International education promotes that. We haven't been selling that story to people.
So, what do we need to do to sell that story? Yeah, the whole, do we need to be on Twitter along with President Trump?
No, I don't think, well, I mean,
I'm
not of the Twitter generation. I mean,
right.
Trump is actually, 70, I guess? I'm 73, but I mean, I wouldn't know how to operate a Twitter account if my life depended on it, nor do I ever intend to. I don't care about that. What I like to do is do what I did as an anthropologist, which is talk to people. Get in front of them so that I can watch their face, I can talk to them.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to get out of our campuses a bit more and get into the communities. I mean, we all live in these communities. It's not like we're cloistered or sequestered. But the idea that the advocacy work that needs to be done is with ordinary folks, most of whom aren't actually in college. And maybe not,
right.
we'll never get there, but they need to hear
Right.
why this is important. Because we need their support.
Absolutely. You know, it just occurred to me that so often in the news media, when there are stories specifically about people from other countries, it's about our helping them. It's not about their helping us, which is, of course, a huge part of what is going on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is still a lot of work to be done inside our universities to help the faculty and the administration define what exactly international education is and how it should be, you know, rolled out. I mean, there are lots of big problems with
Right.
that, but they're solvable problems also.
Right.
The political journalist I.F. Stone said something one time which I thought was really interesting. He said, I'm just paraphrasing, he said, if you get involved in something that you think you can accomplish before you die, you haven't picked a big enough problem.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just the way I think about it.
That's a good
At
way.
age 73, I think this is going to take a lot longer than any of us thought. It is working, but we need to do more with it, you know. And as an anthropologist, I've been fascinated with how large organizations learn or fail to learn.
Right.
And I think higher education doesn't learn very well. And I don't think there's anything one can do about that across the board, but my work at these different institutions has always been trying to figure out ways to build the capacity for learning cross-culturally into the institution in some way. And you do that through the faculty, basically. I mean, you show the faculty this is how this works. You don't make them wrong in any sense. They already know lots of things, but now you're sort of showing them a way to apply what they know and to use what they know
Right.
in a slightly different environment or context. And most of the time that works very well.
And it also changes the lives of the 97% of the students on most
Yes.
American campuses who never leave.
Yeah. And so none of this is flashy, and none of it has the sort of the pizzazz of a capital campaign or anything like that. I wish it did, but it just
Right.
doesn't, you know.
Right.
But what you're doing is with every faculty trip, every sort of study abroad program that you promote, you're creating an invisible college
Yeah.
inside your own institution of people, faculty members mostly, who've been out there and seen what's going on and can come back.
And share that passion
Yeah.
that students return with
Yeah.
and come back and it infuses their lectures and their lives.
So,
Well, that actually brings us to the future. And if I might conclude our discussion by asking you, although I think you've talked about this to a great extent already, are there any, as we go forward in the future, major changes you see in the shape or context of international education and challenges that those changes might present?
I think the future for me is very uncertain right now. Certain things will stay in place. Many of our institutions are quite strong.
Right.
Not all of them are. And the demise of sectors or segments of higher education has been predicted for a long time, and I think
Demise of public funding.
the demise of public funding, right? And so I think this will probably continue, and it will present challenges. The rising cost of everything from tuition across the board to study abroad is going to have an impact as well. The fact that large areas of the world have become essentially no-go areas for many people, and with fairly good reason in some cases. But here's the thing that worries me the most. I mean, I hate to, you know, I'd like to sound rosy. I do. I think that it's a compelling message. I mean, look, we're hardwired, you know, as a species to be curious about the people who live over the hill.
Yeah.
That's how we get a diverse gene pool.
Yeah.
You know, to be very direct about it. That's what it is.
Yeah.
You find out who they are, make friends with them, and marry one of them. That's the way we do it. So that impulse is not going to go away. And the other impulse that I think most of our students have, regardless of their political affiliations or anything you might want to say about generation, whatever they're calling them nowadays, X, Y, Z, is that they want to be of service. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's why they join the military. That's why they join the academy. That's why they join the priesthood. That's why they get involved in the Peace Corps and so forth and so on. Those two impulses meet with international education,
Yeah.
and we need to find better ways of challenging, of channeling those things. But they are not going away anytime soon, no matter what happens. But the thing that bothers me, to come back to that one other point, is the increased presence of adjuncts in our university systems. Now, some campuses have very few. Purdue, fortunately, has far fewer than many places, but at the community college level, where I would argue international education is probably more important than at some other places,
Right.
it's mostly adjunct. How do we find a way to get adjuncts interested in promoting international education? I don't hear much discussion about this, and yet I think it's a major problem.
And also, how do we support them to
Well,
do
yes.
that? Because that is non-existent.
No. And you saw that Chronicle article of last week, which was a very moving plea from one of these people saying, pay attention, you know, this is not a good situation. It's not a good situation.
Right.
So I worry about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there are challenges. I end this discussion choosing at the moment to focus on that marriage of over the hill and coming together and being of service, because it's something, I love that infusion of your anthropological background into international education that's reflected in that. And it's something that hopefully can carry us forward through what in fact are challenging times.
I've always felt that everybody would benefit from thinking more like an anthropologist, and everybody would benefit from study abroad. And so that's
So
been
you
the whole
did a
life story,
perfect
is
marriage in
bring
your
a
own
few
life.
things together. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very
This has been a
welcome.
lovely conversation, and I appreciate it. Riall Nolan. Thank you.